what's your hierarchy on like the mobility, stability, strength pyramid? If you're considering just kind of again the general person, like someone who's doing this 3 to 4 times a week, maybe they're competing. We'll keep them outside of the hopes of reaching, the UFC or something like that. But when you look at mobility, stability, and strength, how do you conceptualize those three things, and where do you really place them on like a scale of importance for people that are just getting in there a couple times a week?
If you look into the research, like the one modality that has the best chance of mitigating injuries, because we can't really prevent injuries, we can reduce injury. It's strength, which kind of makes sense if you think about it, because a lot of times injuries happen because the tissue can't absorb the stress of the event, whether it's
Right.
a joint lock, the joint gets overloaded because it couldn't tolerate the stress or whatever. So, strength training is going to be one of the best things that we can do. Now, if you look at like a mobility as like or mobility in this context of like stretching, so passive flexibility, uh, stretching really didn't show that it decreased injury rate. But I think that you have to kind of think about it in a sense that um, one when I develop a mobility program for someone, like I don't just give them a whole bunch of generic stuff. It's
Right.
what does that person need, and that's related to one, how does that person match up to like the general public, right?
Yeah.
And then two is does their sport require different different that has different goals. So something like jiu-jitsu, for jiu-jitsu you need abnormal hip mobility. Like if you want to have
Right.
an effective guard, your guard has to move a
Yeah.
lot. You look at the spine, like the lumbar spine, it has to be able to flex. It just
Yeah.
has to. Same thing with the neck. So I keep those things in mind, and then from them I'd make if I'm working with someone, I would check their body and say these are your problems, these are the things that I would address first. And then again, when you look at like in research when they do a stretching program, it's like a uniform thing. They do a whole bunch of random stuff, but for mobility, stretching is one component, meaning that we're working on the passive flexibility. I talked about doing something like functional range systems, which also includes how do we strengthen an entire range, which I
Right.
think is ultimately the goal. And if you have to think of like stability, we can kind of back up. So a lot of time there's people that have more range of motion, more passive range of motion that they can control. So there would be someone a lot of times maybe the joint slacks, or maybe those are the people that I would say have lack stability because there's ranges of motion that their body can go but they can't control. So when they're put there, they're going to have a problem.
So would
So,
that be kind of a visual example, like someone who has a butt wink in a squat or something like that, where they get down into the depth with their hips, but then they're not really controlling their pelvis, and so you get that turn. So they're using the range, but they're not demonstrating proficiency over control through that range.
correct. Like
And that becomes dangerous on the mats because if I'm going to pass your guard and your hip has full flexion, knee to chest, but
yeah,
you can't control the resistance level there, and I drive, that can be hamstring issues, that can be lumbar issues, the rotation of your femur, stuff like that. So
uh,
are there other examples maybe that would be a good like visual for someone where not having control over that range could result in injury as a result of that, like I think you called it like a lax joint.
yeah. I mean, uh, like we could think of like an Americana or Kimura, right? So a lot of
Yep.
times people they might be bend more and they only can actively get to like 80 degrees, but then their joint can move a lot further. So then this range, when
Yep.
they're getting Americana, is going to be a problem because essentially if they can't move there, then the tissue is that range really doesn't get stressed very often. So that tissue is
Right.
not going to be as resilient as the tissue that's getting essentially stressed through exercise or whatever. If that
Wow.
makes